All right, ladies and gentlemen, this class recording has started. So, just so you know, as we talked about before, right, I am recording only the screen, so there's no video of you, but if there is audio, it might pick you up, so don't say anything dumb, okay? You've been warned, okay? All right, last night, I asked you guys to read a couple of pages from your book that were called, I believe, Presenting Scientific Data. Why do we make graphs? Jack, go ahead. To chart data. Good. What's the purpose of charting our data? Good. All right. That's what we try to do, right? We try to find trends and patterns. Sometimes it is easier to identify trends and patterns from a graph than it is just looking at a big list of numbers. Okay? So sometimes graphing that data will help us find that trend more easily. Okay? I believe last night the section of your book that you read talked about 3 different types of graphs. Does anybody want to describe one of the types of graphs if you actually read the section from your book last night? Okay? Okay. Lucas, go ahead. A bar graph. Lucas, what kind of data is represented best by a bar graph? Okay, things that can be compared. The way I like to think about it is we've asked one question, but we have multiple answers to that one question. So if we were plotting the annual rainfall in different cities around the world, our testable question is how much rain falls in this city, but we have multiple answers to that question because we have multiple cities. Bar graph would be good for that kind of thing, for a comparison of values, right? What's another type of graph to talk about? Oh, go ahead. A pie chart. What does pie chart best represent for us? Percentages, right? It shows us parts of the whole, right? The circle represents the whole set of answers, and it shows us, then the one shows us the different parts or what percentage of each one it has, okay? All right, those are great, but for the most part in this course, we're not going to use those very often. The one that we are going to use is the last one that they talk about. So what did your book call it last night? Does anybody remember? I don't like the way your book called it or defines it. Your book defines it as a line graph, but I don't like the way that I don't like that the book describes it that way, because that's not how, when you make graphs, it's called, okay? What's the gist of this line graph, or what we'll call it differently a little bit later on? What are we showing there on a line graph? Oh, good. What kind of data do we have to have in order to make a line graph? Oh, go ahead. Stuff over time, but when we talk about making line graphs, we really need 2 measurements, right? We need 2 sets of data, because the line graph allows us to compare one set of data to the other, or to show how something changes over time. One of those measurements can be time, right? And then we'll measure another something else over time, but we still have 2 measurements. We want to compare this set of data to that set of data, okay? All right, with that being said, why don't we do something real generic here and make a sample graph, okay? All right, I'm going to make up a set of data for us to work with. If you guys want to follow along so you see like how to do it while I'm doing it, that'd be great. Or if you just want to watch while I'm doing it and then you'll do it on your own a little bit later, that's fine too, okay? So I'm going to call my first column time and my second column distance, okay? And then I'm just going to make up some numbers, okay? So I'm going to say, like, I'm going to go 1.1, and then maybe 1.9, and then 3.0, and then 4.1, and then 5.2, okay? Totally made those numbers up off the top of my head, okay? All right, then I'm going to come, oh, sorry, I should do one thing. I'm going to insert a row above. I'm going to add a 0, 0 data point. That you don't always have to have a 0, 0 data point, but for this one I'm going to have that. Okay. All right. Then I'm going to add some random distances. So I'm going to go 2.9 here. I'm going to go 5.9 here. I'm going to go 9.1 here. I'm going to go 12.0 here. And then I'm going to go 15.2 here. Okay. Again, I totally made those up. They are not actual measurements, but just so we have something to work with. Okay. Good so far. All right. One thing that when you're working in Google Sheets or when you're working in Excel, if you have Microsoft Excel at home or pretty much any graphing program, notice that I didn't put any units on these numbers. Okay. Time's going to be measured in seconds, distance is going to be measured in meters, but Sheets and Excel don't like it when you have numbers and letters in the same square. It gets confused, okay? So when you're making graphs using Sheets or using Excel, probably best just to use the numbers and don't worry about the units. We'll add those later on, okay? Also, don't worry if Sheets or Excel drop your zeros, okay? We've talked about over the past couple days that those zeros at the end are important for reading the measuring device properly and stuff like that. It's okay if Excel or Sheets drops them. At this point, we're just making the graph to represent those trends, okay? All right. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to highlight the 6 times and the 6 distances, so the 12 squares that I'm going to make my graph out of. Notice I didn't highlight the labels up at the top of the columns, just the numbers, okay? Then I'm going to go to Insert, and I'm going to insert a chart, okay? And when I click that, it should give me a default one, but we can change the type of chart that we make, okay? Here, we have made a measurement of time and a measurement of distance, 2 separate measurements. This would be a good candidate for what your book calls a line graph, but what Sheets calls something else. So if you click up at the top where it says chart type and you use the drop-down box over on the right-hand side, you'll go through and there's line graph and there's areas graph, column, bar, pie, scatter. That's the one we want. And notice in the preview, there's just a bunch of dots on the graph, okay? Those dots represent ordered pairs that are made up from the 2 sets of data that we measure, okay? So I'm going to click scatter chart just like that, okay? And then we're going to go here, okay? So Sheets made a couple of changes to their setup, so we have to do a little bit to fix this, okay? Notice over here on the side it says x-axis and that's blank, and then it says series time and series distance, okay? It's plotting 2 separate graphs, one for time and one for distance. That's not what we want. We want to plot time versus distance. So I'm going to just click right here in the x-axis box where it says add x-axis, okay? And it's going to say what data. So I'm going to go back to my chart and I want to put time on my x-axis. So I'm just going to highlight my 6 times that I entered and I'm going to hit OK. All right? And that didn't do what I wanted it to do. Oh, let's get rid of this one. Let's see if that works. There we go. Okay. Are we good with what we're looking at now? Okay. So I made my x-axis. Did I do that? All right. We have ourselves a scatter plot now that shows the data that we measure. Okay? Oh. I got rid of using row 2 as my header, so now that becomes an actual data point again. So unclick over here where it says use row 2 as header if we don't want to use that as a header. Okay. All right. We've got our graph, but we need to improve the look of our graph. Okay. So what are some things that every graph should have? Kind of what's one? Title. Two titles specifically, right? Which two titles should it have? It should have titles on our axes, right? Okay, so I count that as like one. Okay, so we need one on each, right? And then what else should it have? The main one, okay, like title for our graph. What should your title do for the person looking at the graph? Tells them what the graph is about, okay? Make it a descriptive title, okay? So here, Sheets went in and just kind of gave us a generic time and distance, okay? Let's see if we can do something maybe a little bit better than that, all right? We're going to come over here to the side, and it's where it says Customize, okay? And when you hit the tab that says Customize over on the side, you can see that you have a whole bunch of options for making this graph look better than it does now. So I'm going to go and use this drop-down box for chart and axis titles, and you'll see the first one that comes up here is chart title, okay? Here, it just kind of made this like executive decision to call this time and distance, right? I'm going to call this time versus distance. And even though I didn't tell you where this data came from, let's say it was for a moving object, okay? One thing I don't want you to put is something like physical science lab. All right, or graph 2. That doesn't tell me what this graph is about. Yes, as the teacher, I could probably figure out what it's for, but as some random person reading the graph, they should be able to figure out what it's showing you from the title. Okay? If you want, you can change the font, you can change the size, whatever, and stuff like that. I'm just going to stick with the default for now. Okay? All right, underneath that same big category of chart and axis titles, if you hit this drop-down box where it says type, you can see that there is chart subtitle, fine, but more importantly, horizontal axis title and vertical axis title. Okay? I'm going to start with a horizontal axis title. Okay? It just goes generic and says horizontal axis title, but I want to add something more descriptive. First, if you look at what dots it's sort of putting in and the numbers on the axis, right? You could figure out which measurement is on the x-axis, right? Which measurement is on the x-axis here? Which of my two columns is on the x-axis? Time, okay? By default, we made it time when we were doing like which data goes on which axis, right? So I'm going to put time in here, okay? But what else should we include when we're labeling the axis on our graph? Some kind of unit, right? I didn't tell you this specifically when I made my data, but we're going to measure time in seconds. Okay? Again, we can change the font, we can change the type, and all kinds of stuff like that, but I'm not going to worry about that for now. Okay? I'm going to go back up to where it says type, use the drop-down box, and now I'm going to go to vertical axis title. And it just puts generic vertical axis title, right? By default, we can figure out which one is on the y-axis, right? Which measurement is on the y-axis? The distance, right? So I'm going to type in distance. And again, I didn't tell you this specifically, but let's assume our distances were measured in meters. Okay? So I added my title there. Okay. All right, good so far? All right, we've got a chart title, a descriptive chart title. We've got axis labels that shows us our x-axis and our y-axis. So I'm going to get rid of this drop-down list. All right, what else does our graph need? A key. Probably not a bad idea, although in this one, because we only have like one set of measurements, the title should probably take care of that. If we were going to do time and distance for like two separate moving objects, a key would probably be important so we could tell which line is which. But on this one, when we only have one set of data, the title should take care of that for us, okay? What else do we need? A trend line, or sometimes we refer to that as a what? You might have learned it by a different name last year. A best fit line, okay? First, does our best fit line always have to be linear? Sometimes the data isn't linear, and that's okay, all right? So, I'm going to go to this next tab down that says Series. I'm going to use the drop-down box there, okay? And you can change the color of the dots and stuff like that. You can add labels to your data, but you'll see that one of the boxes there says trend line. So I'm going to check that box, and when I check that box, more options show up. Okay? First, type. Does a linear trend line work for us in this case? Does our data look pretty straight? Okay, no, sorry, that's the label. That's not a data point there. That's so. Sorry, we'll get rid of that in a second. Okay, so this one works pretty good for linear. All right, but you do have some other options here like exponential, polynomial, logarithmic, power. You'll notice if you've looked at your directions for the lab, you're going to use a couple of different types of trend lines for your different sets of data, and that's explained to you in the directions, so we'll talk about that later. Okay? For this one, we're going to take linear. But the one thing that I do want to talk to you about is this one that says label. Okay? Right now, label says none, but if you hit the drop-down box, you have a couple different options. One says custom, so you can just name it whatever you want to, like dogs or cats or whatever, butterflies. But the one that I'm more interested in is this one that says use equation. You learned back in, I don't know, pre-algebra or whatever, 7th grade math or 6th grade math, every line has an equation, and that equation has the same format, right? What's the format of an equation that represents a straight line? Y equals mx plus b, right? And where m represents the slope of that line and b represents the y-intercept of that line. So if I hit use equation, you'll see here on the side, it shows up, and it doesn't have a y equals, it just has a 3.04 times x plus 0.0905, okay? That's the mx plus b portion of the y equals mx plus b equation, which we can use to help us out and figure things out a little bit later down the road. I'm not going to be so concerned about that today, but I do want you to put the equation of that trend line in there. Okay? Good so far. All right. Let's go up here and unclick the series button. Jack, so we're not confused, I'll go here with legend. Okay? And how can I get rid of it? Oh, let's go none. There you go. Oh, undo that. Because it has the equation of the line in there, so we need to keep the legend, although it doesn't have this labeled right here. Okay. Yeah, I mean, you can move it wherever you want to. Right's probably the easiest one, but if you want to move it around, that's up to you. As long as it doesn't obscure what your graph is trying to show me, then that's fine. So okay. All right. Fix something. All right, buddy. So notice down here on the x-axis, we have these numbers labeled, but they match exactly the data that I put in there, which isn't necessarily how you would make a graph, right? The graph, you should label the axis and then show where your data falls along that axis. So we're going to fix that. This drop-down box is horizontal axis. If you use that drop-down box there, you'll see you can change the fonts and all kinds of stuff like that. But this box right here that is labeled treat labels as text, I'm going to uncheck that box. And when I uncheck that box, notice that the y-axis goes back to being like 1, 2, 3, 4, and then the dots just show up at their appropriate locations in relation to where number 1 is and number 2 is and number 3 is. It also adds some grid lines in there so you can kind of show that along as well. Okay? Pretty good. Really? Are you under horizontal axis or are you under vertical axis? I'll come check that a little bit later on. Okay. Do all of you not have that box, or? Oh, okay. Good. I'll come check in a second. Okay. All right. So that's a brief rundown of how we make graphs using Google Sheets. You have 3 graphs to make in Google Sheets. So here, let me pull up real quick so I can show you what you're supposed to do. Good thing you have all this stuff on the recording. Okay, if you flip over to the back side of the sheet that has your data on it, you'll notice up at the top it says graphical analysis. That graphical analysis tells you what you need to do as far as these graphs goes. For example, you need to have a descriptive title. You need to have labels for each axis. And then you have to have a line/curve of best fit. But if you notice, there are different types of lines that I want you to use, different types of best fit lines. So your stoppers, you're going to use the linear one. Okay? But for the gas, the one that with the syringe with the books, you're going to use the one that said power series. Okay? And then for the one where the object is rolling down the hill, one of your options was polynomial. There isn't second order because that's an Excel thing, so it just says polynomial. That's what you're going to use for the one where the object is rolling down the hill. Okay? All right. You have a little bit of time today, not a whole lot, but you will have the whole period on Monday to work on making graphs and answer questions about those graphs. If you would like to start making graphs over the weekend, you can use your Google login, and they'll all be in the same spot, and then you can come back on Monday and start working on them, but you will have all day on Monday to work on them in class. Oh, go ahead. Just to work on the graphs. You don't have any like formal homework because we just work in class on Monday. Okay. All right. Questions. Good luck. I'll be around to help. If you have questions, let me know.